Mark with PT Final Exam. I always get asked this question about dorsiflexion and plantarflexion with an AFO, especially when you're talking about an articulating AFO. Now, there is some confusion. It's often really difficult to picture it or to just visualize it in your head. What is happening and what specific movement places you into hyperextension or knee flexion and in relation to the AFO. Now, when these questions come up, they're often referring to articulating foot orthosis. So articulating ankle foot orthosis. And what that does is it articulates at a certain point. Let me get the pen on here. And what it does, it articulates around the ankle. So kind of around this area, it articulates and it moves in one plane. Okay, so it goes into dorsiflexion and plantarflexion. And what that does is it accommodates and it allows the patient to have some support or have some control in certain ranges. Now, often people will have this if they're having hyperextension moments where they will adjust the angle of the foot to allow for compensation for that. Now, you hear things like Dorsi Flexion stop and Plantar Flexion stop, and there's a question that's bouncing around there, and it's kind of along the lines of you see a patient with an articulating ankle foot orthosis, and during stance phase, they are being pushed into hyperextension. What is going to be the best technique or best type of AFO to assist or prevent that gait deformity? So that's where we kind of go, all right, should we be going into more of a plantarflex position or a dorsiflex position to correct that? Now, when you're talking about a dorsiflexion stop or a plantarflexion stop, how that looks is a dorsiflexion stop. What it does, it kind of, there's a couple of different ways, but more often than not, it's going to attach at the back here, and it's going to be a band that runs up to here. Okay, and this band is going to be on there, and what that does, that band gets tight in that region and it stops the patient from coming up into dorsiflexion. So that band gets tight, it stops you coming up into dorsiflexion, it keeps it in a kind of a good range for that patient. So they take them to a certain amount of plantar flexion with that articulating ankle, and then it stops at this point. So if the patient was having a certain amount of knee flexion, they might do a Dorsi Flexion stop. Now, if we jump and let me erase this stuff. So erase that. Okay, and then we'll grab the pen back and look at this. So with a plantar flexion stop, what often is there's a small screw that gets placed into here, and you access it from here. And what it does, you access it from there and you can wind that down. And what that does, it winds down, it winds down, it winds down, and then it makes contact here at the point that you want it to prevent any further plantar flexion. So by doing that, it stops that patient from going any further down into plantar flexion. So it brings as the foot comes down in this angle, it then comes up in this angle and connects that pin with that plate, which then stops it. So that's the plantar flexion stop, and that's the difference between the dorsiflexion stop and the plantar flexion stop. Okay, let's erase that. Now, so here we've got a ankle foot orthosis. Okay, this is a test one. So what it is, you can put it on over the top of your shoe, so you can keep the shoe on and you can test to see if a AFO is going to work, if it's going to do what you need it to do before they can custom build them and put them inside the patient's shoe or something like that. Now, I've gone very, very extreme with this. Okay, I've gone quite extreme with it in the sense that the angle you see there, I've got it really far into plantar flexion. So I've plantar flexed a lot. Now, when you have a patient that is plantar flexed, part of the issue is the the hyperextension. So if you've got a patient that's hyperextending, quite often you are going into too much plantar flexion. So that shows with the hyperextension, you are wanting some kind of plantar flexion stop on that patient. So if I run this video, okay, you can see I'm coming through there and I'm taking a step and my knee is being pushed into a hyperextended position. So as I go into stance, I go into a hyperextended position based on where that hyperextension is and based on the plantar flexion of that AFO. Now, if I pause that there a second and jump in to grab a pen. The way it works is all to do with the ground reaction force. Now, this is going back, and you kind of, if you do a plumb line, so if I come up to the hip, so my hip here, and I run a plumb line as close as I can down to the ground, okay, what it does is this angle, okay, whenever you are having the force coming up through the foot, the ground reaction force is where that force is being taken into. So for this one, because of where it's plantar flexed, the AFO is wanting to push back to where that plumb line is. So your plumb line is there. Your leg wants to be straight. That's where you get the best stability. That's where you get the best angle. Now, if you are too far plantar flexed, you can see that angle that's coming up there. And what the leg is wanting to do, it's wanting to push here to get to that line. So it's wanting to push to get to that line, and that is why if you've got a plantar flex position, the knee gets forced into a hyperextended position. So plantar flexion and hyperextension link together. So if you have a patient that is being pushed into a hyperextended position, they are going to want some kind of plantar flexion stop to prevent them from going into that hyperextension moment. Now, if I erase this, oh, that's not erasing. So if I jump in here, oh, wrong one. Jump here to erase all of those things, and then and then I play a bit more, you can see just that step. Now I jump into the opposite here. So it kind of looks like I'm still on a hill, but I've gone into really extreme dorsiflexion here. So I've gone into extreme dorsiflexion, and as you can see, if I play this more, that extreme dorsiflexion, as I take stance, it pushes me into a flexed knee. Okay, so this is the patient that's going to want more of a dorsiflexion stop because they're going into too much plantar flexion, they can't control that knee, and they're being pushed into a flexion position. And those patients with weak quads will buckle at this point. So you've got your dorsiflexion stop with your patients going into excessive knee flexion or weak quads or something like that. Okay, so back onto those two, you can see again it's the opposite with this. If I go to the pen, again it's my ground reaction force. So if I come down to here and I get that ground reaction force, my leg wants to be in that plumb line and it's pushing it this way. So based on the angle of the leg and the angle of the AFO, I'm being pushed to that plumb line point. So that's the difference between your AFOs for plantar flexion stop and dorsiflexion stop. So you link them together and kind of say your dorsiflexion, excessive dorsiflexion, is going to be related to excessive knee flexion, and excessive plantar flexion is going to lead to hyperextension. So that is quick guide to plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, and how AFOs and articulating AFOs work with that.